last about 30 minutes or so, and we're going to talk here a little bit more about the sacrificial system, the importance of sacrifice as it was practiced here, and then try to kind of translate that into our own ministry situation. So just to recap here, we have to first think about what role covenant and how God's covenant shapes our own ministry today. Is there some way in which we can, that is, employ the language of covenant with our own brothers and sisters? There was a period when I was in Delaware and in Charlottesville where I did internships, these sort of kind of covenants with a fellow brother or fellow set of brothers about something that we would commit ourselves to doing, for a certain period of time. So for the next 6 months, we'll fast on these days, or we'll pray about this, or we'll make sure that we are unified about X, Y, and Z. So of course, again, that covenant doesn't displace your covenant with God. It's a covenant deal, just like Jonathan and David did, to protect one another and love one another. I think there may be a place for that. You have to think about how that works, and the stakes involved. Then, of course, this. Besides that, there's this issue of holiness, and I'm going to expand on this a little bit here. But we have to remember God's holiness is about His utter and complete or ultimate uniqueness as Creator and as Deliverer, right, and as the covenant-making God, right. So that's important to understand. And our holiness comes into whether we're being shaped in the character of that God. Right, of that Creator, of that Deliverer. So yes, there's a certain level. It's very much our moral goodness, in a sense, is central to that. Our honesty, our integrity, even in some sense, our commitment, our joy. That's what's at stake. But beyond that, we have to then ask, okay, in what ways do I not just simply think about holiness or understand it, but where is holiness apparent in what I do with God? Of course, I think some of that starts with prayer. In recent months here in Richmond, we've had some good talks, among the brothers about prayer being communication with God about what we're doing together, and together meaning us and God, right? And I think that's a beautiful way of understanding prayer, communication with God about what God and I, are doing together with God's people. But holiness does start from the inside out, in other words. Okay. So finally, there's a question that Noah posed, and I think maybe Noah, I think he may have asked it privately about the issue of uncleanness or purity. In this case, that's interchangeable, by the way, and I want to actually elaborate on that because it's relevant to what I was going to say here. Trying to remember, Noah, the first part of your question at the moment. Maybe I've lost it by now because there's been a long exchange. But at any rate, hopefully I'll answer that. Okay, I mentioned that holiness and purity are not identical. Let me cover some material that pertains to sacrifice. That connects the two of those together. That connects purity and sacrifice, or purity and holiness, right? You can only have an instance of impurity or purity because there's holiness, all right? So you can only make a distinction of impurity and purity if there's something holy before you, okay? So this is about definition. So that's the only way that it works. An Israelite could not just simply walk here. So let me share my screen again. They couldn't just simply walk into this area unless they were clean. That they couldn't gain access. If they walk into here, into this area, unclean, they actually defile the area, and their sacrifice will not be acceptable. Okay? So they only, these ordinary Israelites, you could say, only gain access if they've washed away stains of the flesh. That's what the impurity issue is. That is, that I've taken account of where I'm standing before God, whether I'm being fleshly or not. So it was a kind of training of the heart that I do keep watch over myself. I do diligently watch over myself, not neurotically, you know what I mean? Watch over myself, nervous, but if the area is defiled, it actually has to be all purged and cleaned before it can be used again. Okay, so that's in the purity texts in Leviticus 12 to 15. The purity text, Leviticus 12 to 15. I mean, the word flesh is used like 20 times. I think it's actually exactly 20 times. So you have to wash away the stains of the flesh. Furthermore, right, not only are those conditions of the flesh central to determining whether someone is pure or impure, right? One of the main ways that that was expressed was the prohibition on eating the flesh of certain animals in Leviticus 11. You're prohibited from eating the life of the flesh. That's what Leviticus 17:11 states, which is the blood. To eat the blood is to seek life from the flesh, right? So remember, he's trying to actually strike that. To eat blood is to seek life from the flesh. Childbearing, which is probably one of the greatest expressions of flesh triumph over death, defiles in Leviticus 12. That does not mean that it's bad, of course, right? But in light of approaching, right, this whole idea of approaching God, one has to be humbled by the fact that, yes, my flesh is capable of doing a lot, but I cannot rely on it purely and simply in order to approach God. I hope that makes sense. Right? Israelites cannot make themselves pure by being fruitful and multiplying in the flesh, if you know what I'm saying. Right, which I think has some very good implications, right, for ourselves. Skin disease pollutes when the flesh shows through the outer covering of the skin. Right? And that's in Leviticus 13 and 14, passages that we usually, of course, avoid and don't talk about. Emissions from, right, any emissions or discharge from genitals pollute. And in fact, the genitals are called flesh in Leviticus 15. Right, it actually just simply used the word flesh. So only flows or discharges from the flesh defile. All right, not all that come out of some orifice in the body do that, but flesh does spread pollution. Now, beyond that, there are certain sins that pollute the land. And the land actually becomes a victim of pollution. So you remember that image that I showed you, right, of the court, you know, the land surrounding, right, the tabernacle and the courtyard area. Sexual sins in Leviticus 18 actually pollute the entire thing. Idolatry in Leviticus 19, verse 31, and Leviticus 20, that, right, defiles. And bloodshed, which is brought up in Numbers 35. Okay, so sexual sins, Leviticus 18, idolatry, Leviticus 19, and bloodshed, Numbers 35, all of those are forms, you could say, of moral impurity. They're actions that don't have to do with whether you washed up the correct way before entering the temple, entering the courtyard area. It actually has to do with stuff that you've done outside of there that actually defiles the whole area. So it's not contagious in a sense, but it has long-lasting consequences, and only removal from the land, right? So if somebody commits a sexual sin, idolatry, bloodshed, something has to be done to deal with that in order to purify the land. So these defile the holy precincts. Now, in a sense, it doesn't mean that the sinner can't ever go in there or anything like that, but it does mean that it has to be cleansed. Okay, it has to be cleaned in some way. So I hope that makes sense there, right? Of what God is after. Okay. Now, and again, I think I mentioned this before in passing, right? Nothing in the Torah's purity regulations prohibit interaction between an Israelite and a Gentile. Okay, and an Israelite is just as likely as any Gentile to render, you know, themselves or the temple precincts unclean and impure. All right, even though all of this stuff is very partial, right? Even the casting out of idolaters or the serious sexual criminals, the murderers that defile the land, that all have to be purged. That's all a very partial justice. It kills the murderer with the flesh, and that's what I think Jesus was ultimately supposed to address. right, is to go through the flesh, write the law of God onto the heart. But Israel, I just want to make clear, draws near in the sanctuary for blessings and gifts in order to share those with the world. It can be very easy to focus on our own holiness and purity before God and forget that all of this is actually for the sake of the nations. Israel cares for the house of God on behalf of the nations. There's actually two great passages for that, 1 Kings 8 and Numbers 15. 1 Kings 8 and Numbers 15. All of this is done in order to carry the blessings out from here to the world. Okay? Right? It's to be carried out to the rest of the world. So that's what it's important to understand, that we're a sort of nation of intercessors. Ezra 6, verses 6 through 12 makes, I think, that point really well. Israel bears the sins of the nation for the nation. And I think that I think is just something that I think really substantiates our mission very well. And it's, of course, part of the very promise made, remember, to Abraham. Okay? So anyway, just to make that final point, if one is going to approach and offer a sacrifice, they have to be aware of where they are at. All right? They have to be aware of where they stand with God. This is also a very cool image. And I think a question that was asked was whether the tabernacle is facing east out, and it is. The tabernacle is oriented west to east. So when you enter, you're entering from east of Eden back into Eden. Right? Even though we know that this was very partial, right? They hadn't entered into Eden completely. Okay. One of the most beautiful images about this is that this sacrifice that's offered here is not just some kind of it's just something that's arbitrarily selected by God. No, he wants to deal decisively with the flesh. And also, in Ezekiel 16, 8 through 14, the sanctuary is actually described as a gift of bridal clothing. So this is, the idea of the tent of meeting that you sometimes will hear, right? God spoke to Moses from the tent of meeting. The word meeting is the same one that's used for appointment, right, or times together between a husband and wife. So this is also viewed as a kind of bridal chamber where God and his people commune with one another. It's really a very beautiful, so the tabernacle curtains and adornments are bridal garments. The tabernacle is a bridal tent where Yahweh and Israel have their appointed meetings. But the sacrifice and all this is very central to it. In fact, at the end of Exodus, the very end, it says that Moses has to stand outside of the tent and hear God speaking to him from it. But after you read the beginning of Numbers and then go to the very end of Numbers into Deuteronomy, you realize that with Leviticus. When you read through Leviticus, you realize once you start Numbers that now Moses can actually enter the tent. Only because the tabernacle system and the sacrificial system were in place was Moses now able to not just stand outside the tent of meeting, he was able to go inside the tent of meeting and speak to God. But everything in between, the end of Exodus and the beginning of Numbers, is to set up, you could say, a pedagogy, a kind of way of training and shaping one's heart and mind and body to understand that, okay, one, I have to make sure that I address my purity, my cleanness before God. So there's a continuum for cleanness or purity and, from one end to the other, from unclean and pure to clean and pure. So there's that spectrum. And then there's a spectrum of profane and common to holiness and sanctity, right? Of course they each bear on one another, but that's what I meant by the fact that purity and holiness are not identical. Okay, but again, if you could, they each bear on one another, but they're not identical. The sacrifices that are made to God is a ministry, right, to Yahweh, right? It was meant to present something that will take a sacrifice, takes one from the boundary between the sacred and the profane. The sacrifice enables one to cross, you could say. Every sacrifice, each Israelite crosses from the profane into the sacred, that is closer into the presence of God. And really, in many ways, every sacrifice, when every sacrifice was carried out, each Israelite was doing what God did in the flood: destroy the flesh in order to make room for a new creation. Okay. In fact, in Leviticus 21, right? There's a passage there that I'm going to try to actually turn to it. In Leviticus 21, it's actually a pretty large passage. But here, when you read different sections of it, it makes pretty clear that when you approach God, especially for sacrifice, there's got to be a certain. It says that you're presenting the bread of God, which is actually a term of meal, of serving in somebody's house. So even Leviticus 21 also lays out all the requirements for a priest to approach God. But every sacrifice is also a meal. So you're crossing from profane to sacred, and it's also viewed as a meal. After which, that brings humans into table fellowship with God. And that, I think, is probably one of the more inspiring things about it. In Leviticus 6:10 and even 9:24, God let me read 6:10. It says, it must not be baked with chametz. 11, I have given it as their portion of my offerings made by fire. It is most holy, like the sin offering and like the trespass offering. It's interesting there that it's all of that specification on how to bake that bread and offer it as a portion is described in terms of a meal. This is my part of the meal, and you get the other part of the meal. The term used for the offering is the same term used for a meal prepared for a great king by his servants. So, and what's unique about Sinai's covenant is that these sacrifices weren't just a matter of this is what Israel does as table service and then the God eats by himself. No, we offer this sacrifice and God actually uses it to draw near to us, for us to be in his house of hospitality, for us to have a time of fellowship with him. And I think that's something that's very, very important to remember. The last kind of couple of things that I'll mention about the sacrifice. So I just want you to remember two things. One, the sacrifice traverses the boundary between sacred and profane. When the animal, and here I'm generalizing, of course, about sacrifices involving animals, right, and not the other grain offerings and other offerings. That there's actually will be a time later on that I'll give you a little typology of the different sacrifices. I'm not going to do that now. But I just want you to just think generally. Sacrifices were primarily about entering, about coming and accessing God's presence so that one would commune with him, not just, ooh, I'm saving my skin. I better do this, or I'm always going to be walking around. You know what I mean? That wasn't meant to be the heart of it, even though it was manipulated in a number of ways for many years in that very sense. No, the idea was that I want to draw near to God, but I have to take seriously the fact that my life, depending on my flesh, my life with these people has, in what ways has it built distance between me and God? And so this sacrifice is a way of really facing completely, truthfully, and in body and soul, what has distanced me from God? I want to bridge that distance. I want me and all of my family, or me and all the people to dwell with him. And God has actually said no to certain ways of approaching him in order to, yes, welcome them. I think maybe that's one way of putting it. Okay? God's no to approaching him with an unclean or impure heart, in a sense, and not caring, in other words, approaching God without caring about one's impurity or uncleanness, wanting to deal with that is part of God's yes of welcome. I want you to be near to me, but you have to deal with yourself, in other words, in order to do it. So that I think elaborates that, I think, that position somewhat well. So please remember that it's about traversing the the sacred, from the profane to the sacred, and then secondly, that the sacrifice is there in order to enter into a fellowship, into commune with God. So a lot of the things that we read in Leviticus 6 and all the way through into just before the central point of Leviticus, Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement is actually the absolute center of the Pentateuch. It's almost entirely built around the center point of Yom Kippur, of the Day of Atonement, which is for a talk maybe for another time. I won't digress here anymore. But I think we do want to understand that these sacrifices, they really do have that kind of impact. When, for example, a purification offering cleanses the entire sanctuary from the effect of inadvertent sins, and anything that's kind of carried ritual impurity. So a purification offering, that cleansed that whole area. I think someone asked about that. But in the purification offering, the priest eats the flesh of the animal, bearing the sins of the worshipper's guilt, his liability perhaps to punishment and to distance from God. So the priest is the guilt bearer on behalf of the worshipper. The priest eats that flesh. The flesh of the animal represents the worshipper, so the flesh of the worshipper is transformed into flesh of one ordained to enter into the presence of Adonai. So the priest and the altar are both bearers of sin, during that sacrifice. Hopefully I didn't lose you there. Okay, that's what I was just simply providing some detail about the purification offering, because I know some folks asked me a couple of questions about how do you then make the precincts or the area from impure to pure. That is, so it can again be a place where God's holiness could dwell. And it's through that purification offering. But it's very powerful because eating the flesh of the animal is kind of weird in that it almost sounds cannibalistic. He's eating the flesh of the worshiper, but then bringing it into the presence of God. So he's an agent for purging the impurities. It's removing the liability. The transfer of guilt is in that blood of the animal. So I mean, this whole system can get pretty convoluted if you read enough about it. But I think that I think some of you have really captured well what it's about. I saw the little recap statement that was made here before, and I think you've captured it pretty well. So I think the final comment and reflection that I'd like to have here, and if there's other questions that folks want to pose, we can do that for the last 10 minutes. But again, sacrifice, we often will think of sacrifice in terms of what have I given up for God? What have I sacrificed in terms of time and money? Often at times the word, that important qualifier, my, is in there. I will tend to think in those terms. What have I, especially more so when I'm really feeling tired and taxed, I've been giving of my time and sacrificing my stuff, which in the general sense of things is probably what's convicting, is that that's not necessarily true. Our time is not our time. You know what I mean? It's a sacred time. We're devoting time to something, but this time, of course, I think it has been granted to us, and the sacrificing of it. What does it mean to sacrifice time viewed through this? If the time is helping us become aware of our distance from God in order to then say, wow, God is trying to draw near to me, let me draw back near to Him. Let me be aware of myself without getting so caught up in that becomes the goal, right? Which is, we know that's the problem that the prophets, we'll talk about them later, what the prophets, point out is you're just simply carrying out the sacrifices and the ritual actions, but you're still distant from God, and that's right pretty powerful. Right, so you're carrying out all those actions, and we've talked about this many times in many ways about going through the motions, right, and carrying out empty actions in worship and stuff like that. But we have to think here very clearly. I mean, it's an animal lost its life in these actions, and it's very hard to deny a dying animal when it's in front of you. And in this case, a dying animal that was your best animal, or one of your best among the entire flock, and is now being transformed on your behalf to enter into God's presence, so that you realize, okay, even the stuff that I haven't even been aware about, it is being dealt with here. Notice here, God is the one who's saying, I want to deal with it. I want to do it. Do you want to deal with it too? I want to purify this, right? I want to purify all of that, create the conditions for you to come near to me. And so sacrifice in this sense is very much denoting those actions that bridge the gap, from one place to another, so that we can then enjoy fellowship. If it's leading to joy and fellowship, that means we're entering God's holy presence. The sacrifice is made in order to enter into God's uniqueness and goodness that He's wanting to share with everybody, rather than just simply keep exclusively to Himself. And all the while, I think we should probably remember, right, at the beginning of the story is one where we're the creatures that have been made out of the soil. We're the ones that have just the spirit breath, breathed into us and are being sustained by God. So the fact that He has gone, entered the land, travels with the people, and provides all of the conditions of access, knowing that all the while the human beings will want to bucket. That is, they want to establish another way of life. That's what the city, the Tower of Babel, before that the city of Cain, cities in early Genesis, including the Tower of Babel, all kind of signify places where people want to live apart from God. They want to shield themselves from God. They don't want to be looked at. They don't want to be attended to. They don't want to be, in a sense, even cared for. Whereas God is trying to woo back His bride, as it were, to come back to Him. But cities can become a place of, where I'm just going to build up so much stuff around me and fortify myself that I won't have to listen to God. So I think that when it comes to both our evangelism, our Bible study, there are some of these notions could very much come to aid us. What is it? What difference would it make to talk to folks in our Bible studies about a covenant with God? Not just your relationship with God, which has to be spoken about, but the relationship as part of a covenant from a God who's already made promises that He's willing to keep and that He's going to keep. The importance here, of course, of holiness. There's an utter uniqueness to God and greatness to God that He's actually sharing with others. He wants to mold and shape His people, right? We know the passage that's been quoted in, I'm sure, a number of books and sermons, be holy because I am holy. So you can, that's an amazing, sharing in God's own character, rather than pushing people away and do this A, B, and C for me. And then the third is sacrificing, right? Sacrificing is about bridging a gap. It's not just giving something up and, I did it. We have left all things for you, Lord. What's gonna happen? It's not about, I've sacrificed in order to bridge a gap between myself. So that's I think that's probably one of the greatest things that we could do. Let's take a little bit of time here in the final few minutes. If there's, I actually would like us to just simply pray on our own or in a group we happen to be with, just for a few minutes, just 2 minutes to settle ourselves, and then if there's a couple of questions for a few minutes, we could do that. And I think I see someone asked a question. Oh, be holy because I am holy. So Leviticus 20, verse 26, you can find that. Leviticus 20, verse 26, be holy for I am holy. It's also repeated in 1 Peter 1:16. All right. Let's go ahead and take 2 minutes to pray on our own. Almost overwhelming how powerful some of this could be, and how much it reveals about God's own character. But now, looking forward, I'd like, again, once you have read through the material, some of the material will be a little tough to wade through. It's not probably as good as meeting in person and discussing these scriptures. In the Dempster book attempts to give you a very broad biblical theology of the Hebrew Bible. It kind of gives you a narrative overview and how all the parts of the Old Testament fit in a one overarching narrative. I mean, the whole thing. So that his argument is that you can use the notions of dominion and dynasty as something that links Genesis and all of the books in between to Chronicles, right? Which in the Hebrew Bible ends with Chronicles, not with the prophets. The prophets are actually right closer to the first half of it. So I want you to be aware of that. So as you read, give yourself some time, maybe a week and a half to 2 weeks to read, but make sure that before the end of this month, when you look at the Canvas site, right before the end of this month, you'll have to start writing some responses into the discussion section, right? And I'm going to look to see that each person that's taking this course has written, right, the required amount of responses, and hopefully those will be the result of you and your brothers and sisters in your ministry, or you amongst yourselves who are students here, discussing how some of these things could bear on our everyday life in ministry. And here, so in this case, for this period of time, perhaps going to a week and a half, you want to be able to read those sections, the relevant sections of Dempster, and the excerpts that focus on Genesis to more or less Judges. Brother Drew Mines over in Charlottesville is going to help me out with some of the videos. He's going to post some videos on 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, and so we'll start and I'm going to fill in some more videos for Numbers and Deuteronomy, actually starting later on today or early tomorrow. So between now and the end of next week, we'll have videos that fill in the rest of the first 5 books, and that enter then into the period of the kings, of the monarchy of Israel, which is the next unit that we'll be covering right in 3 weeks. So thank you again, Drew, for helping out with that. Drew received a lot of great instruction and is a great student of the Bible, especially when it came to the Hebrew Bible. So I think he'll have some great stuff to share with us about those particular books. So again, make sure that you read. Make sure then after you've read and digested this that you start writing some responses in the discussion section of the Canvas website. Let us, myself and Matt, whomever, know if there's any glitches and things to deal with there. And once all those responses have been made on by the deadline, which is pretty much the end of this month, I'll grade each one and put it in the grade book that's in the Canvas site itself. Okay, and so you want to make sure you don't spend all of your time here just working on the Pentateuch, Genesis, right to Deuteronomy, and even a little bit beyond that, Joshua and Judges. You probably only want to take about the next week and a half or so, 2 weeks, and then start reading the sections that you need to read for the section on the monarchy, okay, the northern and southern kingdoms. Okay, so I'm just saying that in order to make sure that you manage your time well, you don't spend the next 3 weeks just Genesis and Deuteronomy. Okay, so thanks very much. I love you all. It's really a great pleasure to do this with you. And I'll stick around for a little bit if there's any other questions to be asked that I can answer quickly. Otherwise, have a great day, and Godspeed.